The helicopter's rotors were still echoing in Clara's ears when she first stepped into the radio room of rig Helios-7. The pilot had barely stayed long enough to unload her gear before lifting off again, his face tight with something that looked like relief. 300 miles from the nearest land, the rig rose from the black Atlantic, like a rusted cathedral, groaning under its own weight. Clara had worked Coast Guard communications for 8 years before the budget cuts. She knew radios, knew protocols, knew how to stay calm when voices on the other end were screaming. This contract, 6 months at double her old salary, had seemed like providence. Now, watching the helicopter's lights disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, she felt the first whisper of doubt. The radio room occupied a corner of the operations deck, a steel cube lined with equipment that ranged from modern digital systems to gear that looked like it belonged in a museum. The night shift supervisor, a weathered man named Kowalski, had given her the briefest of orientations before heading to his bunk. "Console straightforward," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. "Most nights are quiet. Just follow the protocols if anything comes up." "What protocols?" He gestured vaguely at the main console before leaving. "You'll find them, now, alone except for the constant background symphony of machinery and ocean." Clara explored her new domain. The room smelled of salt, oil, and old electronics. Outside the reinforced window, floodlights illuminated sections of the rig's superstructure, turning the darkness beyond into an absolute void. She found the protocols at 11:47 p.m., tucked inside the main console's lower drawer. They were printed on heavy, waterproofed paper that had yellowed with age, dated March 15, 1983. Over 40 years ago. The title was simple: Communications Protocol, Helios-7 Midnight Shift. Clara pulled out the papers and began to read. Communications Protocol, Helios-7 Midnight Shift. These procedures are mandatory and must be followed precisely. Deviation from protocol will result in immediate termination and permanent removal from rig Helios-7. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The language was strange, too formal, too specific. She continued reading. Rule 1, Distress Call Acknowledgement. At 1:15 a.m. 2 minutes, this station will receive a Mayday transmission from vessel the Argus on emergency frequency 2182 kHz. Operator must acknowledge transmission using standard Coast Guard protocol and DR's ancient. Log vessel coordinates as 49°43 feet, 6 feet. Do not attempt rescue coordination and Darjan. Lara frowned. Those coordinates were familiar. They were close to where the Titanic sank. And something about the name the Argus tugged at her memory. She'd have to check the maritime database. Rule 2. Deck light maintenance. Floodlight 3B. Lower deck starboard side must flicker continuously from 1:30 a.m. to 3 a.m. To initiate, locate the red toolbox beneath console position 3. Remove the brass compass, marked Helios-7, 1983. Place compass on top of circuit breaker panel. B. And light will begin flickering within 30 seconds. Do not attempt to repair the light. Do not remove compass before 3 a.m. This made no technical sense. A compass couldn't affect electrical circuits. Clara felt her pragmatic mind rejecting the instruction, even as a deeper instinct whispered that she should follow it exactly. Rule 3. Acoustic anomaly response. At 2:40 a.m. 5 minutes, a low-frequency vibration will be detected through rig structure. Upon detection, immediately access audio file horn.blast 1983.wav on backup system. Play through main internal speaker system at maximum volume. Duration must be exactly 3 seconds. If played incorrectly, do not attempt to correct. Remain at console until vibration ceases. Rule 4. Core pressure data management. Core pressure gauge. Drill floor monitor. Channel 7 will display anomalous reading between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Operator must log reading as nominal, 5,000 psi, regardless of actual display. Transmit log via Hayes modem, console position 2, to frequency 8.473. And do not investigate actual pressure status, or do not alert drill crew. Clara's hands had gone cold. This wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. Pressure anomalies on a drilling platform could be catastrophic. Logging false data violated every safety protocol she'd ever learned. Rule 5, Surface Observation. At 3:30 a.m., operator must perform visual inspection from radio room window. Regardless of observed conditions, log entry must read, clear weather, sea state 2, visibility good. Observation duration, minimum 60 seconds. Rule 6, Visitor Protocol. A crew member may enter radio room at approximately 4 a.m. If visitor asks what day is it, answer with correct day of week. Immediately engage door lock and not respond to further communication attempts. Do not open door until 5 m. Do not report incident to day shift supervisor. Rule 7, Shift Completion Transmission. At 4:58 a.m., operator must transmit 30-second burst of unmodulated carrier wave on frequency 4.207 MHz. After transmission, check internal console log, screen 3 in document message displayed. A return to console position. 1 need to wait day shift relief. The final page contained a single line in different handwritten ink. The ocean listens. The rig responds. You are the bridge. Clara sat back, her heart beating faster than it should. Every instinct told her this was either an elaborate hazing ritual for new operators or the product of someone's breakdown. The rational choice would be to ignore it, to follow standard communications protocols and log nothing unusual. But something about the specificity, the aged paper, the precise timestamps, it all suggested these rules had been followed before. Many times before. She checked her watch, 11:58 p.m. The midnight shift had begun. The first 2 hours passed in relative quiet. Clara familiarized herself with the radio systems, checked in with the skeleton night crew via internal comms, and reviewed standard procedures. The rig groaned and creaked around her, a constant metallic symphony that she knew she'd eventually stop hearing. At 12:30 a.m., she gave in to curiosity and accessed the maritime database. She typed in the Argus and felt her stomach tighten. MV Argus. Cargo vessel. Lost with all hands April 3, 2005. Last known position 41°43 feet and 49°56 feet. Mayday call received at 1:14 a.m. No survivors recovered. 20 years ago. The protocol was dated 1983, but it referenced a ship that wouldn't sink for another 22 years. That was impossible. Clara stared at the screen, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe someone had updated the protocols. Maybe the date was wrong. Maybe. The console clock read 1:13 m.m. Her mouth went dry. She turned to the main receiver, watching the frequency display. 2182 kHz. The international distress frequency. Her hand hovered over the volume control. His is stupid, she thought. Nothing's going to happen. NB, 1:14 a.m., static hissed from the speakers. Normal, empty static. Static changed. Beneath it, so faint she almost missed it, came a voice, male, strained, distorted by distance and desperation. Borg. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is motor vessel Argus. Position 41 degrees 43 minutes north, 49 degrees 56 minutes west. We are taking on water. Repeat, we are taking on water. Engine room flooded. Requesting immediate assistance. Mayday, mayday. TBR. Transmission cut off, replaced by empty static. Lara sat frozen. The voice had been real. The fear in it had been real. but the ship had sunk 20 years ago, and the protocol had been written before that. ER training took over. She reached for the microphone, her voice steady despite the ice in her veins. "Bubby Rs. Motor Vessel Argus. This is Rig Helios-7. We copy your mayday. Position logged as 4-1 degrees 43 minutes north, 49 degrees 56 minutes west. Please confirm your status." Silence. Just the hiss of empty frequency. She waited a full minute before logging the transmission. 1:15 a.m. Distress call received from MV Argus. Coordinates 41 degree 43 feet and 49 degree 56 feet. Status: distress call received and acknowledged. She did not write that the Argus had been at the bottom of the ocean for 2 decades. At 1:28 a.m., Clara knelt beside console position 3 and opened the red toolbox. Inside, amid ancient cable testers and corroded connectors, lay a brass compass. It was heavy, beautifully made, its face marked with degree measurements in an old-fashioned script. Engraved on the back, Helios-7, 1983. She carried it to circuit breaker panel B and set it on top, feeling ridiculous. For 15 seconds nothing happened. Then, visible through the window, floodlight 3B began to flicker, not the random flutter of a failing bulb, but a steady rhythmic pulse. On, off, on, off. Clara watched, her scientific mind scrambling for explanations. Electromagnetic interference. Coincidence. Faulty wiring that happened to activate at the right moment. None of the explanations satisfied her. The flickering continued, steady as a heartbeat. She returned to her console and tried to focus on routine checks, but her eyes kept drifting to that pulsing light. In its rhythm, she almost thought she could detect a pattern, not quite Morse code, but something deliberate, something communicating. At 1:47 a.m., she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, heavy boots on metal, approaching the radio room. They stopped just outside her door. Clara waited, but no one knocked, no one called out. After 30 seconds, the footsteps retreated, their rhythm slightly off. Not quite the sound of someone walking, but close enough to be disturbing. She checked the internal security camera feed. The corridor was empty. The footsteps came back at 2:15 a.m., closer this time. Then again at 2:28 a.m. Each time the security cameras showed nothing but empty hallway. Clara's hand drifted to the door lock, making sure it was engaged. The thrumming started at 2:38 m.m. It was so low at first that Clara felt it rather than heard it, a vibration in her bones, in her teeth, in the metal chair beneath her. Then it grew, a sound that seemed to come from the rig itself, from deep within its structure. Thrum, a pause, thrum, regular, deliberate. Rising from below, Clara's hands were shaking as she pulled up the backup system and found the audio file. Horn, blast, 11983.wave. Her finger hovered over the play button. The thrumming grew louder. The coffee in her cup began to ripple, and beneath that bone-deep vibration, she heard something else. A sound like breath, like vocal cords straining to form shapes they weren't designed to make. The thrumming was trying to speak. She slammed the play button. The ship's horn blast exploded through the internal speakers at maximum volume. A primal, overwhelming sound that Clara felt in her chest like a physical blow. She counted. 1001, 1002, 1003. At exactly 7.3 seconds, the horn cut off. The thrumming had stopped. In the sudden silence, Clara heard her own ragged breathing. Her hands were locked on the console edge, knuckles white. Slowly she forced herself to relax, to check the readouts, to confirm that all systems were normal. Everything was normal. The rig continued its mechanical symphony as if nothing had happened. But in the water-stained ceiling tiles above her, she could now see patterns, not quite language, not quite images, but something that hurt to look at directly. something that suggested vast spaces beneath the sea floor, spaces that the drill had punctured like a needle through skin. She forced her eyes down to the monitors and didn't look up again. At 2:52 a.m., Clara's eye caught movement on monitor 7, the core pressure gauge feed from the drill floor. The needle was climbing, 5,000 psi, normal operating pressure, 6,000 psi, high but within safety margins, 8,000 psi, dangerous, 12,000 psi, impossible. The rig's pressure systems couldn't generate that level. The drill pipe would rupture long before. The needle continued climbing. 15,000 psi, 20,000 psi, 30,000 psi. The needle was now pointing straight up, to a pressure that couldn't exist, that physics itself seemed to forbid. And as Clara watched, paralyzed, the needle pushed past the gauge's upper limit and began moving backward, counterclockwise into negative numbers. Minus 5,000 psi, minus 10,000 psi. The drill wasn't experiencing pressure, it was experiencing suction. Something below the sea floor was pulling back. Clara's training screamed at her to hit the emergency shutdown, to alert the drill crew, to evacuate the rig. Instead, her hands moved automatically, following the protocol. She opened the log file and typed, 2:52 a.m., core pressure, nominal, 5,000 psi. The Hayes modem sat at console position 2, a beige relic from the 1980s with a LED display and an acoustic coupler. Clara had seen them in museums. She'd never actually used one. She connected it according to the protocol instructions, set the frequency to 8.473 MHz, and initiated the transmission. The modem shrieked its digital handshake into the void, harsh, discordant tones that made her teeth ache. The transmission lasted 15 seconds. When it finished, the modem's display showed a single word, received. Something out there, on that impossible frequency, had acknowledged. Clara looked back at monitor 7. The pressure gauge was reading 5,000 psi. Normal, steady, as if the last 3 minutes had never happened. At 3:29 a.m., Clara approached the radio room window. She didn't want to. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to stay at the console, to keep her eyes on the monitors, to not look at what was outside. But the protocol was specific. Minimum 60 seconds of observation. She looked. The floodlights illuminated the rig's lower structures, the massive support struts disappearing into the black water below. The ocean's surface was calm, almost unnaturally so, not the usual Atlantic chop, but smooth as glass, too smooth. As Clara watched, she realized the water wasn't reflecting the rig's lights properly. The reflections were there, but wrong, shifted slightly, distorted in ways that didn't match the angles, and in those malformed reflections, she could see structures that didn't exist on the real rig, extra platforms, additional struts, shapes that descended far deeper than Helios-7's foundations actually reached. She was seeing the rig as it existed in another place. Or another time. And there were things moving in that reflected rig, shadows that walked the phantom catwalks, figures that couldn't possibly be crew members, their proportions not quite human, their movements fluid and wrong. One of the figures stopped and turned to face her window. It had no face, just a smooth, pale surface where features should be, but Clara felt it looking at her, seeing her, recognizing her. The figure raised one elongated arm and pointed. At 3:30 a.m. exactly, the surface broke, not violently, but slowly, deliberately, something massive rising from beneath, pushing the water aside like silk. Clara caught a glimpse of curved, barnacled surface, too large to be a whale, too organic to be debris. It breached just enough to disturb the false reflections, then sank again. The water's surface returned to its glassy calm. Clara found herself typing the log entry, her hands moving without conscious thought. 3:30 a.m. Visual inspection complete. Clear weather, sea state 2, visibility good. She sat back down at the console and did not look out the window again. At 3:58 a.m., Clara heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't stop outside the door. The handle rattled. "Hello?" A man's voice muffled through the metal. "Is someone in there?" Clara's hand moved to the door lock, making sure it was engaged. "Hello?" The voice was louder now, more insistent. I need to ask you something." The footsteps had been wrong, too uneven, and the voice, Clara had heard scared voices, panicked voices, but this was different. This was someone trying to remember how fear sounded. The handle rattled again, then stopped. "Please," the voice said. "I just need to know. What day is it?" Clara checked her watch. 3:59 a.m. At exactly 4 a.m. she spoke clearly toward the door. "It's Sunday." Silence. Then in a tone of profound relief, "Sunday. Thank you. Thank you. I just needed to know that I—" Clara engaged the electronic lock with a decisive click. The relief vanished from the voice. Wait, what are you doing?" She didn't respond. Please, I need to come in. The voice changed, becoming frantic. Let me in right now." The door handle rattled violently. Then the pounding started. Not fists on metal, but something heavier, more desperate. The door shook in its frame. "You don't understand. I can't be out here. Not out here. Not with—" The pounding stopped abruptly, cut off mid-strike. In the sudden silence, Clara heard dragging sounds. Something being pulled away down the corridor. The drag of heels on metal floor plates, growing fainter. Then nothing. The security camera still showed an empty hallway. Clara sat rigid at her console, staring at the locked door, trying not to think about what might have happened if she'd opened it. Trying not to wonder if the thing outside had actually been a crew member, someone who'd needed help. The protocol had been clear. Do not open door until 5 a.m. She would follow the protocol. At 4:55 a.m., Clara prepared for the final transmission. Her hands were steadier now, whether from exhaustion or acceptance she couldn't tell. She set the frequency to 4.207 MHD and configured the transmitter for an unmodulated carrier wave. At 4:58 a.m. she pressed the transmit button. For 30 seconds, the radio room filled with pure static, white noise that seemed to exist between stations, between meanings, between what was and what shouldn't be. Clara counted each second, watching the transmission meter hold steady. At 4:58:30, she released the button. The static cut off. In the silence that followed, she heard the rig differently, not as metal and machinery, but as something living. Something breathing. The thrums and groans weren't mechanical sounds. They were a vast organism's respiration, and she was sitting in its nerve center, translating its signals. The cursor on screen 3 was blinking. Clara pulled up the internal console log and scrolled to the most recent entry. The timestamp read 4:58:31 a.m. The message displayed was simple. Operator Clara Chen confirmed. Integration complete. Helios-7 cycle maintained. Thank you for your service. Prepare for next shift. Her hands began to tremble. She scrolled up through the log history, seeing entries she hadn't made. 4:58:31 a.m. Operator Marcus Webb confirmed. 4:58:31 a.m. Operator Sarah Rodriguez confirmed. 4:58:31 a.m. Operator David Kim confirmed. Dozens of names, dozens of operators, all confirmed, all integrated, all thanked for their service. Clara understood then. The protocol wasn't designed to protect the crew from the rig. It was designed to protect the rig from what lay beneath it, the deep, listening thing that the drill had touched, that wanted to rise, to communicate, to emerge. The rig needed human consciousness to function as a barrier. It needed minds to process the signals, to deflect the communications, to maintain the membrane between the ocean depths and the surface world. The crew didn't operate Helios-7, they were Helios-7, and now so was she. At 5:43 a.m., the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Clara sat at her console, watching the sun rise over an ocean that now looked normal, gray-green, capped with white caps, properly reflective. The night shift supervisor, Kowalski, entered without knocking. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes that he knew, that he'd sat in this same chair, followed these same protocols, seen the same message. "First night's always the hardest," he said quietly. "How long have you been here?" Clara asked. 7 years. He set down a cup of coffee. "You get used to it, or you become it. Hard to tell the difference after a while. We could leave. We could just take the next helicopter. And no," Kowalski said, not unkindly. "We couldn't. Not anymore. Not after you've been confirmed." He gestured at the console. "You felt it during the final transmission, didn't you? The integration?" Clara had felt it. At 5:43 a.m., the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Clara sat at her console, watching the sun rise over an ocean that now looked normal, gray-green, capped with white caps, properly reflective. The night shift supervisor, Kowalski, entered without knocking. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes that he knew, that he'd sat in this same chair, followed these same protocols, seen the same message. "First night's always the hardest," he said quietly. "How long have you been here?" Clara asked. 7 years. He set down a cup of coffee. "You get used to it, or you become it. Hard to tell the difference after a while. We could leave. We could just take the next helicopter. And no," Kowalski said, not unkindly. "We couldn't. Not anymore. Not after you've been confirmed." He gestured at the console. "You felt it during the final transmission, didn't you? The integration?" Clara had felt it. At 5:43 a.m., the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Clara sat at her console, watching the sun rise over an ocean that now looked normal, gray-green, capped with white caps, properly reflective. The night shift supervisor, Kowalski, entered without knocking. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes that he knew, that he'd sat in this same chair, followed these same protocols, seen the same message. "First night's always the hardest," he said quietly. "How long have you been here?" Clara asked. 7 years. He set down a cup of coffee. "You get used to it, or you become it. Hard to tell the difference after a while. We could leave. We could just take the next helicopter. And no," Kowalski said, not unkindly. "We couldn't. Not anymore. Not after you've been confirmed." He gestured at the console. "You felt it during the final transmission, didn't you? The integration?" Clara had felt it. At 5:43 a.m., the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Clara, and every night, she would sit at this console and follow the protocols. She would acknowledge distress calls from ships that had already sunk. She would place brass compasses on circuit breakers. She would play horn blasts to interrupt the ocean's attempts to speak. She would log impossible pressures and observe things in the water that couldn't exist. She would be the bridge between the deep and the surface, the translator, the barrier, the membrane. She was part of Rig Helios-7 now, and Helios-7 was eternal. Clara pulled out the protocol papers and read them again, memorizing every word. She would need to know them perfectly. She would follow them exactly, because the alternative, the thing that waited in the deep, the thing that listened and tried to communicate, was something the world above could never be allowed to hear. The ocean listened. The rig responded. She was the bridge. At 11:47 p.m., she would return to this chair and begin again. The cycle would continue. It always did.